Good. That's better. So on behalf of Auberson Abels, my colleague Sonia de la Fuente, whom you will see very soon, and myself are very happy to welcome you to this afternoon's session. What it means to be green, this is the question we will address this afternoon. In this context, we will mainly discuss greenwashing, transparency, and regulations. Other sessions in this building are addressing other topics, so if you feel you're not in the right room, you may still have time to go and join the other room if you want. And if not, I really thanks all of you here for your interest in the topic. And I also want to thank the organizers for having invited us to organize this session today. So our session will be divided into two parts. In the first part, my colleague Sonia de la Fuente and myself will introduce the topic, and we will then give the floor to our panelists who will be able to express their views on these issues. We are thus very pleased to welcome on the stage Mrs. Joanna Preissig, who is member of the Executive Board of the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, FINMA, Mrs. Elodie Feller, who is Global Policy Lead at the United Nations Finance Environmental Program, Finance Initiative, so the UNEP-FI, it's easier to pronounce. We are also welcoming Mrs. Amandine Favier, who is Head of Sustainable Finance of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF Switzerland. We also have here Mr. Christoph Baumann, who is Envoy of the State Secretary of Sustainable Finance, SIF. And we also welcome Mr. Eric Borremans, who is Head of ESG at Pictet Asset Management. Thank you all for being with us today. We'll look forward to hearing you in a few minutes. I propose that we start now with the first part. As you can see on this slide, our presentation will be divided in 7 parts, but I promise we will be short, so it will be 7 short parts. And first, we will provide a definition, if there is one, of what is meant by green investment and green washing. So is there a legal definition? We will then present the issues related to greenwashing. What are the disadvantages of greenwashing? We will then see how to prevent or combat greenwashing. What are the strategies that authorities can put in place to prevent or combat greenwashing? We will then analyze which strategies have effectively been chosen by the authorities to prevent or fight against greenwashing. What are the rules in the EU and what are the rules in Switzerland? And we will conclude this overview with a list of gaps and challenges that remain to be addressed in the future and which will also be discussed by the panel. So, is there a definition, a legal definition of green investment? And the answer is no. There is no legal definition of green investment. The EU taxonomy states that for an economic activity to be considered environmentally sustainable, it must meet 4 main conditions. First, the activity must make a substantial contribution to at least one environmental objective. The EU taxonomy provides a catalogue of 6 environmental objectives, and among these objectives is, for example, the climate change mitigation, the climate change adaptation, pollution prevention and control, and so on. So there are 6 of them. Second, the activity must not cause significant harm to any other environmental objective. Third, the activity must comply with minimum social safeguards. And finally, it must comply with the technical screening criteria which are applicable to each particular activity. In Switzerland, there is no legal definition neither, but the recent Swiss climate scores give an idea of what is a green investment within the Swiss meaning. The Swiss climate scores are a tool recently developed by the Swiss Federal Council to help managers, banks, and insurers to assess how climate-friendly investments products are. This tool takes into account different criteria, which are namely greenhouse gas emission, exposure to fossil fuel activities, verified commitments to net zero, management to net zero, credible climate stewardship, and global warming alignment, which is an optional criteria in this tool. And this tool is a kind of Swiss answer to the EU taxonomy. The idea here is to create a forward-looking transparency about the future achievement of climate goals. There is also no legal definition of the term greenwashing. The EU Action Plan defines the term, and I will read the definition, as the use of marketing to portray on an organization's products, activities, or policies as environmentally friendly when they are not. And the ESMA, so the European supervisory body, defines greenwashing as market practices, both intentional and unintentional, whereby the publicly disclosed sustainability profile of an issuer and the characteristics and or objectives of a financial instrument or a financial product, either by action or omission, do not properly reflect the underlying sustainability risks and impacts associated to that issuer, financial instrument, or financial product. In other words, it is like talking the talk without walking the walk. And as you understand, these are, greenwashing consists mainly in misleading and deceptive practices. Greenwashing may arise on three levels. The first level corresponds to the level of the financial institution providing asset management services. On this level, sustainability relates to the financial institution's own operations. On the entity level, the risk of greenwashing can, for example, arise if there are not enough resources available or when sustainable investment approaches are poorly implemented due to the lack of sound investment processes. On the level of the investment products, the risk of greenwashing can result from inadequate communication on sustainability practices and features in the product description. And the third level refers to the interaction between a financial service provider, for example, an asset manager, and the investor. And in this case, greenwashing can arise, for example, when a financial service provider fails to provide precise and detailed information about the sustainable investment approach or the benefits of a sustainable investment product to an end investor. In its communication 05-2021, FINMA gives some examples of greenwashing practices in relation to investment funds. So we will not go through all of them, but obviously there is a greenwashing practice when, for example, for a fund, no sustainable investment strategy or policy is actually pursued. Or, for example, and that's very important for FINMA. Maybe Mrs. Pressig will say a few words on that. But the stated impact or savings cannot be measured or verified. This is something very important, the capacity of measuring impact. When an asset manager says he's doing impact. And you have the full list of these examples of practices on this slide. So what are the issues at stake in connection with greenwashing? And greenwashing practices present risks at three levels. First, for financial markets, greenwashing represents an obstacle towards the transition to a sustainable economy. Capital that is supposed to be directed towards sustainable activities is actually directed towards non-sustainable activities. Another important drawback of greenwashing is that the potential loss of trust is the potential loss, of trust in sustainable finance policies. And it's well known how important trust is in the proper functioning of financial markets. Greenwashing can have negative effects on financial market participants themselves. As we have seen in recent cases in the US or in Germany, for example, greenwashing practices can have a very negative effect on the reputation of the relevant financial market participants. Greenwashing can also represent a financial and a commercial risk, actually, for financial market participants, especially if their greenwashing practices are accompanied by legal actions against them by investors who have been deceived or claim damages. Finally, greenwashing has, of course, a negative effect on the investors themselves, since they are deceived by these practices and do not invest as they would have wished. So after these few considerations on the definition and the issues at stake, I will now give the floor to my colleague Sonia de la Fuente to speak more specifically on regulations.
Thank you, Antoine. So, as we have seen, greenwashing is a critical issue, a critical risk for the market, for the investors, and it has been addressed in various regulations in the EU as well as in Switzerland, regulation or self-regulations. But first, let's just take a step back and see what are actually the possibilities, the regulatory strategies to address greenwashing and sustainability in general, actually. The first important distinction is between regulation and self-regulation. Regulation, so basically hard law, is mainly the EU approach, while in Switzerland we have a different approach because Switzerland has mainly chosen the self-regulatory answer to greenwashing. Then we have what are the potential strategies. So one first strategy will be limiting financial market participants' freedom by prescribing certain investment criteria, so a quite hands-on approach. It could be translated by, for example, discouraging or even excluding certain investment. So prohibition, for example, in investment in arms manufacturers products, or by actively promoting certain investment, creating some incentives to favor certain types of products. It could be, for example, tax incentives. However, this is not the approach that has been taken by the EU or Switzerland so far. In the current regulatory landscape is based on restructuring the decision-making process, which basically means redefining the roles of the market participants, the financial market participants, the investor itself, and this approach is based on the main tool of this approach is increased transparency. How do we achieve increased transparency? There are many possible ways to achieve this goal. Currently, we can identify two main pillars in the approach, in the strategy in the EU, and by way of, and also in Switzerland. These three ways or three pillars are first setting a common framework to assess sustainability, to be able to recognize what is a green product from what is not a green product. The second pillar is, and it's accessing, giving access to better data, because of course data is a key element of transparency. The third and last pillar that we can identify in the current regulatory landscape is engaging with clients on sustainability issues. So having a discussion with the final investor to make it really part of the process, and that is really a key element of redefining the decision-making process on investment, to include sustainability and green products in particular. Now, how do we implement increased transparency concretely? So you have here, you will have several very detailed tables. Don't worry, we won't go through all these details. It's just to give you the key elements. So to start with the EU regulation, setting a common framework, that is the EU taxonomy. The EU taxonomy gives a classification that should, or hopefully will, allow the market participants to claim, to say, I have a sustainable activity based on the classification and the criteria set in the EU taxonomy, and also for investors to recognize and to create trust on the market. Then, how to give access to better data is through disclosure-related regulations. In this regard, you have fundamentally, basically, three main instruments. First, you have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR, the taxonomy regulation as well, because it contains some specific provisions on disclosure, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is not yet applicable. It should be adopted in this month of the year, and it will replace the current non-financial reporting directive in the EU. These three instruments have the purpose to create, they are all mandatory. The purpose is to force, to some extent, the financial market players to disclose information on their. So first, for the SFDR and the taxonomy regulation, for financial market players to disclose information on their risk, sustainability risk, and principal adverse impacts, how sustainability impacts their activity, and how they impact as well sustainability themselves. And the last one is corporate disclosure. It concerns mainly the targets, the companies where we'll be investing. In the context of this disclosure, the companies will have to inform about how, again, for example, climate change can adversely impact their activities, but also how their activities can impact climate change or environment in general. But it's not limited to climate. So that's what we call the double materiality. Then about engaging the discussion with clients, these are the Asg Preferences, which is a quite recent change in MiFID II, which has been is applicable since August of this year. And the purpose of these new rules, it's again to engage a conversation about sustainability, about to understand to raise the attention of clients, if needed, that it's possible to invest in green products, and to assess to what extent they are interested in such products, and if they are, to really incorporate green investment in the objectives of the investor. And of course, that has an indirect impact to some extent, that in order to be able to answer and to educate the client, the investor, the financial market players, typically the asset manager, needs to have maybe a better knowledge, or to know what he's talking or she is talking about. In Switzerland, we have a similar approach. The general architecture, it's the same, basically. We certainly see an acceleration of the answer and the reaction and the measures taken in Switzerland to fight greenwashing. As regards the common framework for assessing sustainability, that would be the climate change scores, which is a very recent tool, which has been adopted or launched in June of this year. Regarding disclosures, related regulations, we have mainly two instruments. First, it's the review of two circulars from FINMA, the disclosure banks and the disclosure insurers. These two instruments apply to, of course, banks, insurers, but not to all banks or to all insurers. So the scope, it's limited to some extent because it applies only to systematically important banks, which is really a minority, as you know, of the banks in Switzerland, and large insurance companies. This one point and important, which is quite a departure from what we know in Switzerland so far, these rules are mandatory. They are provided not in self-regulation, but in FINMA circulars. And the second instrument, or second provisions, are the articles 964b et sequitur of the Swiss Code of Obligations, and a draft ordinance on climate reporting that it's not yet has not yet been adopted, but should enter into force in the beginning of next year. These are more or less the response or the equivalent to the CSRD in the EU. So these rules regard corporate disclosures. However, one important distinction is these rules apply only to listed Swiss companies and large supervised companies, while the CSRD applies to all large companies in the EU, whether listed or not. And finally, we have the answer, the Swiss measure regarding how to engage clients in the discussion about sustainability, and by consequently to prevent greenwashing, are the also very recent guidelines of the Swiss Banker Association, dated of June of this year, that will enter into force at the beginning of next year. These are also mandatory rules to some extent, because they only apply to the members of the SBA, but however it's more than 200 members, banks, but also professional associations actually. And non-members of the SBA can opt to comply with these rules. These directives are more or less very much tend to very much replicate what is provided under MiFID II with regard to Asg Preferences. And then we have one last table, one last type of communication, type of self-regulations, which regards one part of the financial market players, specific group, which are the investment fund industry. First, we have the FINMA guidance preventing and combating greenwashing of November of last year, that where it does not provide for rules for obligations, not directly at least, but it describes how FINMA understands what FINMA considers greenwashing practices in the fund industry, as well as a description of what should be an appropriate organization to be able to actually implement a sustainability within the fund, the investment funds. So there is a part about the products and a part about the entity at the entity level. And very recently, September 26th, so about two weeks ago, or 1 week ago, the AMAS, so the Association for the Fund Industry, also published a self-regulation on transparency, which to some extent integrates the guidance, the insights of FINMA in its guidance of November last year. Finally, we are coming to the end of this first part. Here you have some gaps and challenges that we can identify. I won't go into details here because some of them maybe will be addressed directly by our panel. Thank you very much for your attention.
No? Yes. Thank you very much, Sonia. And now we arrive to the panel session. And first of all, I would like to let you introduce yourself very briefly so that we know who you are, even though I already told a few words on you. So maybe Mrs. Preissig, if you want to start.
Hello. Yeah. Hello, my name is Johanna Preissig. I'm working at FINMA. I'm head of Strategic Services Division. That's also the division that includes the Sustainable Finance Unit, which coordinates all works FINMA is doing in the field of sustainability. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you to you. Mr. Baumann.
Hello, so my name is Christoph Baumann. I'm envoy for sustainable finance at the Swiss State Secretariat for International Finance. In that role, with my team, we represent Switzerland in all the international organizations and fora on sustainable finance, as well as lead all the regulatory work and domestic work, such as making TCFD mandatory in the real economy and financial industry.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Feller.
Thank you for having me. My name is Elodie. I'm the Global Policy Lead at the UNEP Finance Initiative. We are the host of normative frameworks on sustainable finance, such as the Principles for Responsible Banking, the Net Zero Alliances. And my role is to connect those voluntary normative agendas with the regulatory and policy environment. And I just spent 2 years at the European Commission working out the EU financial regulatory framework, so that's why I may talk a little bit too much about the EU in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Borremans.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Borremans. I'm head of ESG for Pictet Asset Management. We are a small team. We're a team of 7. We like to think of ourselves as lean and mean. On a more personal note, I've been in the field of sustainability for the last 30 years, first as an environmental consultant working primarily for industry across all sectors, and for the last 20 years in sustainable finance, 10 years at BNP Paribas Asset Management, and now for 10 years at Pictet. So I look forward to the debate.
Thank you, Eric. And Mrs. Favier?
So I'm Amandine Favier. I'm the head of sustainable finance at the WWF, so the WWF Switzerland, not international. We're the leading environmental organization worldwide, and in Switzerland, our team is focusing on really engaging the financial sector. I mean, we do the rating. Maybe some of you saw that. We have a rating of the retail banking industry in Switzerland or pension fund. We also have a big program on central banks and financial supervisor worldwide, looking at what they do, trying to push them to do more, to integrate more nature into their macro and microprudential regulation. And we also work on methodology and to integrate better biodiversity. It's a big topic for us now within financial portfolio. So we're doing a lot, maybe a bit too much, but we try. And on a private note, I've been working before, now over 10 years for WWF, and before that I was working in the financial industry before.
Thank you very much, Elodie. Sorry, not Elodie. Amandine, sorry. So now we have a first question, and maybe I will address it to Mr. Baumann. And the first question is, what is and what is not, within your understanding, a truly sustainable investment?
Well, you kind of start with the key question, so interesting. So I think we're in the midst of governmental work. The Federal Council is producing work by the end of this year to come up with its thinking or to communicate its thinking. So I cannot discuss that in details. I can share my personal views, and I think it's very important when you look at an investment to really ask what's the motivation of that investment. So it's less about the procedures that went into selecting this investment. It's really what is the investment itself. And I think there's three different motivations. The one motivation, which is very important as well, is to reduce financial risks in the portfolio stemming from sustainability aspects. And that's a large part of ESG investments are focused on that, and that's very important from risk-return characteristic. It's also the fiduciary duty to reduce relevant financial risks. The second part is when you really align an investment with sustainability goals. And the third one, or the second one, is an example for that is you invest in a company that has a transition plan that is externally verified and is on progress of achieving that transition plan to net zero. And the third one is more complicated. It's when you actually want to have an impact with that investment towards a sustainability goal. Now, when you look at these three motivations, I would say, and to answer your question directly, I would say a sustainable investment is either an investment that's aligned with sustainability goals or that has an impact. Simply reducing financial risk, that's fiduciary duty. It's very important as well, but that in itself, to me, is not a sustainable investment.
Okay, it's not sufficient. Thank you very much. Amandine, do you have also do you want also to express your ideas on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a tough question, but at the same time, we're at the core. I think a lot could be said, but we have, I will say, a similar view, pretty similar view at the CIF. So, for us, a sustainable investment product needs really to contribute to a world which is, going to transition and stay within planetary boundaries. So that's very theoretical, but basically an ESG, let's say a ESG product would try to optimize the ESG risk for us is really not a sustainable product. And it's all a question of terminology, when to use what. And I think it's really also about going beyond trying to define sustainable or responsible investment today as we do by how you do a financial or like a responsible investment product. So now what I call process based. So, you do exclusion, you do ESG criteria, you do this, you do that, and that's sustainable. That's how it's being done today in Switzerland. And I think we really need to go away from that to really look what's in the product. So for me, it's negative and positive impact, the exposure it had to some certain sector, and if he really actively contribute to an environmental goal and can really report on it. And I think it's so, like Christophe said, if you have a fund which is claiming to be climate friendly, he has to really demonstrate that he's contributing and aligning to a 1.5 degree world and not contributing to a 4 degree world. Or if you have a fund which is an SDG or have any SDG, claims, he has to really show how it contributes to some sustainable goal, and also it's not actually harming other environmental goals. So this do no harm. It's yeah, it's something very important to us. So, and again, it's all a question, I think, on terminology and defining a bit more clearly. We'll, I think, come to that. And maybe one question I have, and would be interesting to discuss in the panel, sorry, projecting, is can we really define what a sustainable investment without having any kind of taxonomy? I think that would really interest me. Yeah, I go directly, like a boom. I think it will really interest me to hear the different opinion on that.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking this question.
Okay, we can address it now or later as you wish. Later, okay.
Can address later.
So, Amandine, as you have the mic, I had another question for you. What are, in your view, the roots creating greenwashing?
Yeah. So, I mean, we thought a lot about this question, and we realized, I mean, we can talk about, there's a lot of, different reasons why we have greenwashing, and I think we'll come back on it in the panel. A lack of definition, I just already mentioned, a lack of common standard, a lack of common terminology. But at one moment, what I was realizing, especially yesterday, if I'm a bit provocative, when I hear certain panel discussion, that greenwashing is also simply because some financial institution or some company decide to just communicate more than they do. So it's about really talking more than you walk. And I just want to say it because it's a conscious decision for any company or financial institution to decide to do this or to decide to have, an honest communication and accurate communication. So I just want to place this key message because it's important for me. And then, yes, there is other factor than that. There is clearly a lack of common standard, a lack of common definition of what's sustainable. It's an issue. A lack of data on what's really, how companies are really performing on an environmental point of view or sustainable point of view. So there's a combination of factors, but I would say the fact that greenwashing happens simply because it happens, in a way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And now I have a question for FINMA. I wanted to know whether greenwashing was critical for FINMA and why.
Yeah, yes, I think if greenwashing wasn't critical, we wouldn't be sitting here and discussing about it. So yeah, short answer, yes. But as we all know, the annual growth of sustainably invested money is massive. This is a great opportunity for the market, but of course, providers don't want to miss out on this trend. At the same time, however, the topic is very complex. Sustainability is multi-layered, it occurs in different dimensions, and as we all know, it's not at all defined. So our inquiries show that there are very clear cases of greenwashing. Individual providers promise too much, and we saw, for example, I mean, you mentioned some of the examples, but we saw funds that were designated as sustainable without corresponding investment strategy being documented or pursued. And what we often see is just the fundamental lack of transparency. Here in this category, we find cases where it's often impossible for the customer to find out, for example, which exclusion criteria the product actually follows. So very simple cases where there is no transparency at all. But yeah, if you are interested in more examples or more cases of possible greenwashing risk, then I can refer you to our guidance, which we issued last November. Maybe I can say something to where our mandate is. Our mandate is to protect financial market clients and investors from improper business conduct. With regard to greenwashing, we want to prevent investors from being deceived about green characteristics of products with unsubstantiated and or misleading promises. This is where we start, and maybe beside the risk that investors are deceived, There is also legal and reputational risks that come along with it for market participants and the financial market as a whole.
Thank you very much for these explanations. Now I have a question for Elodie regarding the transparency. So we have seen that transparency is now the way that has been chosen by authorities to prevent and combat greenwashing. In your view, is it the correct way to do that, or are there other means to combat greenwashing? What do you think about transparency?
Thank you for this question. I mean, transparency is key, right? I mean, that was just said. Transparency is about substantiating a claim. So investors have to be protected, consumers have to be protected. So for that, you need transparency. But I think we need to move a little bit beyond transparency, because what matters is what transparency, right? So you want to know what's behind the data that you disclose. And for that, you need underlying frameworks. You need KPIs. You need to know what's good enough. Because you can be transparent about why you think you're green, but is that good enough? And so this is where regulation comes in place. And regulation says this is the baseline. This is the do no significant harm, under which you're doing harm. So you're not green. And then where regulation and actually policymakers can also shed some light on is on the direction. Indeed, what is net zero? What is green? For which economic activity? For which type of companies? And green means from climate across all environmental objectives, and it also include actually inclusiveness and social elements. So transparency is great, but transparency is not going to lead us anywhere unless we know what type of transparency we want. And also transparency is not going to be good enough to take us through the transition, because this whole debate around greenwashing is interesting, and it's there because investors are interested in this, but at the end of the day, what we need is to transition the real economy. And so yes, banks are interested in not being caught through legal liabilities and reputational risk. Their regulators can help with labels, taxonomies, and products, product labels or standards. But does that mean that their balance sheet is transitioning? Does that mean that the portfolios are transitioning? And for that, transparency is not good enough unless there is some kind of invisible hand that hasn't been at work for a long time, right? And so regulators can help not just provide the transparency, but they can also help provide direction. And I think the finance industry right now is asking for this type of direction. At least in the EU, it's been asking for it. It's not a done deal. The framework is very imperfect. But I think this is where it's moving. The EU strategy last year was about the transition. It was not about transparency. So greenwashing is something we need to resolve along the way, but it's not the end goal.
Thank you very much. Eric, do you want to add something on that?
Yeah, yes, I would like to add on to what Elodie said and maybe comment briefly on what Christoph Baumann said. I agree that, yeah, transparency is necessary but not sufficient. You need to have transparency. Well, let me use an analogy. You can ask two persons who one speaks Chinese, the other one speaks Brazilian, to be very transparent. They will be very transparent, but because they don't share a common language, it's going to lead nowhere. So you cannot have transparency without a common language, first of all. So we need a common language, and that goes into the nitty-gritty, because the devil is in the detail. Number two, you have to be transparent about intentions and results. And the two are absolutely key. One without the other is meaningless. And I use deliberately the term intentions as opposed to motivations. Why? At Pictet, 3 years ago, on the eve of finding a way through SFDR, we decided that, right, we would have a global standard applying to all funds and mandates that would pretty much replicate the SFDR Article 689. So Article 6, we are very clear with clients that, look, we will look at sustainability risks, we will take into account carbon intensity and corporate governance, but beware, we may expose you to high ESG risks by investing in companies with deficient governance or with high carbon footprint. Just for your information, they are sustainability risks, they are material, but we understand them, we're willing to take them and being rewarded for it. And that's absolutely essential. That's what we plan to do. If we're talking about Article 8 or Article 9, or take Article 9 as an example, what we intend is to invest on your behalf in economic activities that contribute to solving environmental or social problems. Taxonomy, social, I mean, you name it. We can have a separate discussion on that. The reason I use intention as opposed to motivation is because the motivations can be multiple. Someone can buy an electric car because they want to save on their fuel bill. Someone can buy an electric car because they want to reduce their carbon emissions, or both. They're not exclusive to one another. I guess what matters at the end of the day is that someone drives an electric car and, yes, granted, refills it with renewable electricity rather than coal-fired power stations. That goes without saying. Today we have that common language. It applies globally in Switzerland for European clients and also in Asia and everywhere. So we have our global standard internally. But I'm afraid, I guess, in industry, and as SFDR or the Swiss auto-regulation gets rolled out, getting the common language is still something that we need to work on collectively.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now I would have a question for Mr. Baumann regarding the regulation, and this is a particular interest for lawyers as we are. So we know that in the European Union, the law is what we would call hard law, so it's compulsory, whereas in Switzerland, it's, at least for the time being, rather voluntary. And it's issued under self-regulation laws by opposition to real regulations. What do you think about that? Do you think that there would be a better way in Switzerland to implement rules regarding greenwashing?
So when you look at greenwashing at the different levels, actually on the institute level, we are regulating now with TCFD. We are focusing very strongly on quantitative data like transition plans, scope 1 to 3, emission targets of companies. So that alleviates it to some extent at the institute level. On the institute level, on the further side of that, we are strongly supportive of GFANS initiatives. We are working now together with the industry towards industry agreements that support transparency on the individual institutes transitioning as part of GFANS. So on that level, this work is going on. On the level of financial products, as you mentioned, you have the two self-regulations, one by the Banking Association, the other one by AMAS. And I think this is in the tradition of the principle of subsidiarity in Swiss work. We let the industry go forward with their work, and then we observe and see is there remaining inefficiencies that weren't addressed by this industry work, and then we step in if we see there's a market inefficiency which we need to address from federal council level, and that's exactly the assessment which we're currently holding, which we're currently conducting on our side.
Okay, this is the path you took from a long time ago in this very field. Okay, understand. Elodie, would you have comments on these issues regarding regulations?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So UNEP-FI is an organization that comes up with normative frameworks. So they're voluntary frameworks, and we've been doing this for decades, right? So the PRI was set up in 2005. And those principles already say you have to commit, be intentional motivation, you have to commit to something, integrate it, and then disclose how you've done it. Voluntary frameworks have been out there for 2 decades, not just for investors, not just for banks or insurers or companies. You all remember the SASB versus GRI conversations, right? So I think we're reaching a point whereby we need actual data from the financial sector, from the corporate sector, that is framed in a standardized way. And again, I repeat, where we can say this is good enough or this is not good enough. So this is what regulation, in my view, brings to the industry. If you have committed to net zero and you say my balance sheet will be net zero by 2050 and I've set my milestones, you want to ensure that at some point everybody does it as well, because otherwise you lose your first mover advantage. Regulation helps mainstream this type of commitment into the corporate governance or the disclosures of financial institutions. Now, is financial regulation going to help lead banks to net zero alone? Absolutely not, right? So we cannot just say, oh, because you're going to disclose or because you're going to have to set targets, you're going to have a net zero balance sheet. You also need to work out real economy pathways. You also have to work with the clients. You also have to work on real economy regulation. So to the very question of do we need regulation on banks and investors to disclose and to act? Yes, that helps mainstream the practice, that helps frame the conversation amongst financial institutions. Is that enough? No, we also need action in the real economy because they're not detached. So we cannot talk about greenwashing in the financial sector without talking about what's happening on the ground as well.
Amandine?
Yeah, no, just to add that I think we have on this, I mean, clearly the same view. I'm still, when asked this question, I'm still puzzled because I'm still thinking, how can you have an uniformized reporting, generally talking about climate or anything, without regulation? I mean, everybody will just disclose on what they want, and now we talk about climate, but for any topic, I really see how that can work. And we see it very well also with accessibility reporting. I mean, we have now a lot of framework for company to report on the sustainability, the GRI reporting, and it's a self-regulation for most of the stock exchange for now decades. And if you look at the percentage of the company who do have a sustainability report, we're not there yet, neither. So it's clearly we need regulation for having a good reporting framework. And I will say, I mean, my view, I will say for fighting greenwashing in generally, I think there is two ways. Either you have very, very detailed regulation that really tells what's green, what's not, what's sustainable, what's not, and go into granularity, or you have some principle-based, goal-oriented requirement, much more high level, but are coupled with very strong enforcement power from the regulator, from the supervisor. And I think, honestly, in Switzerland, we have neither those two for the moment. We have some vague, like auto-regulation, high-level requirement without real enforcement power. And that's the situation.
Eric, I see that you're smiling. Do you want to comment on that?
Because I'm mentioning the supervisor. I was smiling too.
Maybe I can say something to that. In our view, the fight against greenwashing could be much more effective. The anchoring, as you said, of certain principles in law would create a level playing field and could also significantly improve the situation. What would be helpful in our view is, for example, binding provisions for sustainability-related transparency. By this I mean requirements in the area of pre-contractual product transparency, let's say in the prospectus or in the fund contracts, etc. And also requirements in the area of subsequent reporting in the semi-annual or annual reports. And furthermore, obligations at the point of sale would be very useful, such as the obligation to inquire about and take into account sustainability-related customer preferences. So, maybe in this regard, I would also like to state that the voluntary self-regulation of the industry in the area of the investment advice and in asset management, as you mentioned, is a step in the right direction. However, it's not a substitute for government regulation. The principles I mentioned could establish a level playing field across sectors. They also have the advantage of being enforceable by FINMA. It might also prevent negative examples which could otherwise damage the reputation of the financial center, or in other words, it could enhance the reputation and the credibility of Switzerland as a sustainable financial hub.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether someone wants to add on that or comment.
Well, quickly, but then after. No, I mean, what you said, I think it's very clear. If there's not a legal basis, the supervisor can't really, act. And I think that has to be said. I mean, that's important, and we're not there yet. So yes, we need regulation. And for me, a sign also that auto-regulation has limitation. I mean, we saw with a recent Hamas, I mean, it was published last Friday, so I haven't read in full detail, but auto-regulation of Hamas on greenwashing, and yes, it's a good step in the first direction, and it's good, but they don't refer to the climate score in it. There's no reference to the climate score in the Hamas self-regulation on greenwashing. So it will be now to the parliament, honestly, to decide and to make that mandatory. So for me, it's like the limitation. It's a concrete example for me of the limitation of having only self-regulation.
Thank you very much. Now we have discussed regulations, and I had a question for the industry, and I wanted to know what were the challenges you were facing. And my question is directed to Eric. What are the specific challenges you were facing when implementing the EU regulation on transparency?
Yeah. Well, where to start? No, look. I mean, as I said in the introduction, I've been in the sustainable finance industry for 20 years, coming from industry. And it was a bit of a shock. Industry is very regulated. Hazardous sites, operating permits, discharge limits, I mean, you name it, the list is endless. And by contrast, in 2002, it was a regulatory desert. There was nothing. So the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, with its various ingredients, including SFDR, is, as Emmanuel Faber was saying this morning, it's nothing short of a gigantic anti-greenwashing machine. But there is a but. It leaks. It's powered by a solar panel, meaning you cannot use it at night. And the user's manual is not very user-friendly. So we're struggling. It's not within its deep. But look, it is what it is. And it's definitely better than nothing. At least it's the solid embryo of a common language. Not perfect, but we are getting there. And over time, things will fall into place. But there are challenges. Back to your question. One of the challenges, the green taxonomy is only halfway there. We're nowhere near having a social taxonomy for very good reasons. It's a political hot potato, and there's no chance it will happen between the 2024 European Parliament elections, so maybe 2025, touch wood. And that will be a source of intense debate. And back to the analogy with the washing machine, there is a button to set the temperature, but they forgot to tell you whether it's degrees centigrade or degrees Fahrenheit or degrees Kelvin. Well, your guess is as good as mine. And this has very concrete implications. I mean, everybody, for those who haven't seen it, I invite you to look at the Morningstar study of 28th of July that compared 10,000 funds, Article 6, 8, 9. And focusing on Article 9, they extracted one very important ratio. That's the ex-ante commitment to portfolio alignment with sustainable investments. We can debate on the definition. Let's assume that we all agree what is sustainable investment and we have the same idea. Well, nevertheless, it's Wild West. The commitments range from 0 or say 10% to 100%. Why? You know, it's as if someone had asked us, okay, go and measure the temperature in that room. We all go, and we come back and we give a number without specifying whether it's degrees centigrade, Fahrenheit, or Celsius. So we cannot compare. We don't have a common language. PAIs, data availability, there's 60 plus PAIs, some mandatory, some optional. 50% of those PAIs, half the PAIs, less than 20% coverage today. So it will work, but over time, we need to give it a bit of time. And there are other challenges. I'm not even getting into the mushrooming of taxonomies in all parts of the world and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a bit of a Wild West. There are some rules, they are getting there into place, but yeah, it's an interesting journey.
I understand. Thank you very much. Elodie, as you worked for the Commission for 2 years, do you have any comments on that? Because it's a European commission, European regulation.
Oh yes, it is. Thank you, Eric. So, disclaimer: my file was not SFDR. My file was taxonomy regulation, and I'm not going to comment on the SFDR in and of itself. I think what matters is that in the EU financial regulatory environment right now, when it comes to sustainability, we've had to work out different layers. So you have the corporate layer, then you have the banking layer, which is both a corporate and a lender, a credit institution, and then you have the investment layer. And the problem we've had is that we've tried to resolve the investment issue before we tried to resolve the corporate and the banking issue. So the SFDR is a bit of the victim of this, is that it has to disclose on what others first don't disclose, and it is the first to basically try out all those KPIs and taxonomy assessments. So is that a big problem? I tend to agree with Eric that, yeah, from an implementation standpoint, there is still a couple of years of work, and actually our supervisory authorities in the EU are going to struggle, and they are really trying to help the Commission fix this. Now, if you take a little step back, right, and you think, well, you know, PICTE and investors are going to struggle for a couple of years, and then you take a step back and you say, in 3 years, in 2025, yeah, we have enormous amounts of data coming out of companies, coming out of banks, and I say banks, it wasn't mentioned Pillar 3 disclosures, prudential disclosures. So we're coming with an enormous amount of data that in 2025 may not make sense to everybody in this room or elsewhere, but that is going to be a good baseline to start figuring out what's in banks' balance sheet and portfolios, and especially what companies are doing. In terms of implementation struggles, companies are going to be the actual first one to struggle with the CSRD and struggle with the taxonomy regulation, because this is what matters, right, what they do. And then what investors will do is just take their data and aggregate that at portfolio level. It is as simple as that. The SFDR is way too complicated, and that's true, but for other pieces of legislation, investors will just aggregate and say, oh, this is what my underlying companies do. Banks, at another level, because they have much more granularity in their balance sheet, are going to struggle even more than investors to do this. Try to do taxonomy alignment on your SME portfolio, on your mortgage portfolio. So yes, the difficulty is there, but I think the regulatory authorities in the EU, and I think pretty much everywhere where there is a will to regulate, are in agreement that it's not going to happen from one day to another, but we need this data. At some point we need, and the policymakers need this data as well. And they need reliable data that they can supervise, that they can base further policies on. So we need to work this out together. I'm not going to go through the whole implementation challenge list, because there are many more than just the SFDR. But I'm confident that in 3 years we can say we've achieved something much greater than we thought we had today.
Thank you very, very much, Elodie. Now, regarding EU regulation, one question we already kind of touched today is the question whether Switzerland should adopt a taxonomy. This is the question, maybe, and I know it triggers a lot of discussion. And maybe I will ask the question first to you, Christophe.
So, very complex question, because it's, I think, multi-layered. So, I think when you look at the international landscape, also as negotiated within the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and Roadmap in general, I think there's the common understanding that alignment approaches, such as taxonomies or portfolio alignment metrics, such as the climate scores, they need to have the same language or the same ambition on the ground. So it's absolutely key that whatever taxonomy a country does, whatever alignment approaches a country does, it's in line with net zero by 2050. It incorporates really the science-based carbon budgets available to the various industry sectors and industries. And I think when you look at taxonomy, it's an alignment approach that looks at an activity-based, but there are similar approaches that look at an entity-based, such as the transition plans, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then you have metrics that look at the portfolio level, taking into account this entity level. And I think internationally, it's a consensus that these approaches are all valid as long as they have the same credible base assumptions in the background. They need to be equally science-based in the background, and then they should actually lead to the same result. So to answer your question more directly, it depends. So when a Swiss issuer, such as the government, as now announced, is issuing green bonds, you need a certain taxonomy, a legal basis that says in what green activities you can use the proceeds. When it comes to transparency on financial products, we actually believe that it's more important to have a whole of economy approach. So as an investor, it's key to understand who are the leaders and laggers in each industry, who is the cement company who is taking the transition seriously and who has a transition plan to net 2050 that's science-based and externally validated versus the cement industry company that doesn't take it seriously. And I want to invest in the former and not in the latter. And to us, a taxonomy is too much focused on what is now green or not green, and doesn't have this forward-looking component looking really at the date where you need to be net zero. So I think on this overall transparency era, that's why we've developed the Swiss climate scores, and we really try to make them as science-based as we can possibly be, to really lead to the right incentives. And I do think it's complementary to taxonomies to some degree, because it really answers different questions. A taxonomy says, what activity or how much of your portfolio has already sustainable activities now, whilst the climate score says, is your portfolio on track to be net zero by when it counts, which is 2050, and on track meaning externally verified science-based transition plans.
Okay, thank you very much. Amandine, do you want to add something on that?
Well, it goes to my first question. I'm still wondering, can we really try to fight greenwashing without defining what's green? I mean, that's still the same where I'm thinking. And I used to say, like already 2-3 years ago, well, when I was in panel, and usually the Swiss industry is not very in favor of taxonomy, and I still believe it. I was saying, look, taxonomy is like winter, you like it or not, it's coming. It's coming, yeah, I mean, it's coming. It's summer, you can take it. Okay. No, but like it's coming, and Switzerland cannot also stay like an island in the middle of Europe. So all the asset managers which are, having any activity outside Switzerland, and there is a lot, they have to do it. They have to, comply by the taxonomy. Having said that, I do think that taxonomy, and I think we will need a kind of taxonomy for Switzerland. I think we should avoid to duplicate. So, I mean, inventing our own taxonomy. I think that, and then we have a multiplication of taxonomy. It's not helping neither. And I think that taxonomy need to really not only focus on defining what's green, but also defining what's gray, so the transition activity, and what's brown. So if it's too hard sometimes to define what's green, let's start to define what's the worst of the worst, right? What's brown? And actually, we published, I mean, for the one who want to look at it, WWF, we launched a call for action to central bank and supervisors last week, and we try to define, I won't call it a taxonomy because it's not granular enough to be called a proper taxonomy, but we try to define a list of what we call always dirty activity. So it's a list of what we think is brown, and it's a first step for dialogue on try to define this. So yes, I believe we should, in a way, Switzerland, try to have a taxonomy, but which is science-based, very important, not policy or politics-based, so science-based, and which is really focusing not only on the green, but also on the transition, and defining what's transition activity.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, for sure, Elodie. You may have something to add from an international perspective also.
Yes, I just wanted to point to that thing that I hear a lot, and again, the taxonomy is not something that doesn't look into the future, right? The taxonomy tells you where an economic activity should be in order to be net zero in the future. And what is interesting about a taxonomy is that it connects the sustainability of the company with its financial reporting. So what the company reports is proportions of turnover, of OPEX, operational expenditures, and capital expenditures. So what is the company investing in that is green in the next 5 to 10 years, depending on the economic activity? So yeah, it's not a transition plan at entity level. It's still very much activity-based, I agree. But it is linked to actual numbers that an investor can look at. And I would tend to agree also with what Amandine and Christopher have said. Taxonomies and transition plans are absolutely complementary. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Transition plans are also at entity level an interesting frame. Right now, it's not very well framed, but it's an interesting concept that needs to be better framed, better defined. And just to finish on the international level, there are over 20 jurisdictions, the EU being one, it's 27 member states, that are developing a taxonomy under governmental leadership. Not necessarily all of them have adopted that as part of their regulatory framework, right? But they're looking at defining the green, as Amandine was said. And so what is the harm in trying to define green? What is the harm at trying to say what's green in a specific jurisdiction, in a specific context, and for the sake of reaching our global climate goals and environmental goals? So I won't respond for Switzerland, I think, but globally, there is indeed a movement at trying to define what's green.
Thank you very much. And now I have a very last question, and then we will move to the public for questions. If you have, we will have 10 minutes in the end to answer this question. So a very last question, and I will address it to Eric. And the question is whether you think that the current legislative approach gives or provides a level playing field for banks, for example, for like yours.
Well, I'm speaking on behalf of the asset manager here, so I'll specifically refer to the AMAS self-regulation. How am I going to say this? It's a good start. It's good, but it's a start. There is a certain amount of congruence between what we observe today, not on the classification, but at least on the requirement to be transparent on an ex-ante basis through the prospectus. We have gone into the same level of detail for our Swiss funds than for our European funds in the prospectus, except that it's less structured. The pre-contractual template model is much more rigid. I mean, there's a template and just fill it in, don't discuss. Whereas here we can discuss, which is great. And trouver un arrangement, find a compromise. So that works really well. But well, is this enough? In our case, it's not really an issue because we opted voluntarily for an SFDR-like framework, which has become our firm-wide framework. So we kind of opted out for more stringent regulation. But I'll take a step back from our own case. And I'll go back to another analogy, which is football. In football, you have two teams of 11 people who play against one another, and their aim is to mark as many scores within 45 minutes, twice, maybe extra time. And there are rules of engagement between players, and there are referees and yellow and red cards. And everybody agrees that. To me, the self-regulation we have today is as if we were saying, all right, we're going to play football. there should be at least 2 teams, but if you want, you can have a third one. The size of the team, well, it's for the teams to decide. Play for as long as you like, but within a reasonable time. And rules of engagement, well, just don't kill the opponent. And if you harm him, just be discreet about it. And referees, it's for the public to decide. With that, we can play football between us, but we won't qualify for World Cup or let alone European Championship. So, ball is in our court.
Thank you very much for these very vivid explanations. So now we will move to the public, and I see that there is already one question here. So I will just... Monsieur ici. And so I will just ask you to say who you are, for which company you're working, and to whom you address your question.
Okay.
If you have one person in particular.
My name is Claude Begley, Swiss New Water. The question is general, probably to Mr. Bormans, because it is a follow-up of your statement. Which benchmark to consider as reasonable in terms of green commitment of a company, knowing that there are so many moving targets and so many different ways around the world to measure it? Just an example. With our company, we try to offer solutions which bring hygiene and fight pandemics on one side, but in an ecological way on the other side, and of course both goals are a bit contradictory, so we try to find a balancing act. For that, we're extremely interested to get green certificates. We happen to have built a factory in India, and there are a dozen of different green certificates, and some of our customers, they say, I want this one, others, they want the other one. Some would like to follow the EU legislation, others the US regulatory. It's just a jungle. There are 2 ways to get ISO certificate, the complete one, but also there is a shortcut, which is absolutely official and legal. The same for the CE certification. And you can continue with the cycle analysis, life cycle analysis, carbon footprint, net zero, and everything. So finally, and I don't want to be critical of anybody, but we've seen that green certification has become a business, and that sometimes the cousins of the ministers and people well-placed, they are the ones who do the study so that another member not far from them would give the approval. In that circumstance, coming back to Switzerland, how do you judge the compliance of a company which has to face that reality without reopening of the question of the initiative of a responsible multinationals? That's not the point. But from a greenwashing point of view, where do you fix the criteria in front of such a disparity?
Thank you.
The question was easy.
Of course. And I'll try and answer in a very concise way. Right, look, I think you very well described the operational difficulties that are associated with any industrial activity. I guess from our point of view as investors, and not as private equity investors, mainly invested in listed equities, meaning that we have, look, at Pictet we invest in 4,000 companies plus asset management, that is. And I'm not even talking about the passive strategies that will replicate many more indices with many more names. So by construction, we don't have the time or the resources to fly people on site and check it out and do a proper audit. We rely on you, actually, to have your own compliance systems in place. But at the end of the day, it boils down to corporate governance, which we compare to the brain of the organization. So our one of our key entry points is to better understand who's on the board, what do they do, how do they contribute, is the board functional or dysfunctional? And if we get confidence that the board is doing a good job, that will give us indirect confidence that things are happening on the ground. And then there is an acid test, and the acid test is what we call controversial events. Have you been caught by the regulator, by NGOs, by Amandine and her gang or crew, or by justice, or have there been employee disputes, labor unrests, pollution events, and so on and so forth. And to us, that's the acid test. Now, in and of itself, it's not a guarantee that things are going well on the ground, but if we have assurance that the brain is functional and that you haven't been caught, that will give us confidence that you know what you're talking about, you're addressing the risks, but also taking advantage of the opportunities that the business you're in offers. Now, obviously, everyone in the investment world has subscriptions to data providers. Some are generalists, MSCI, Sustainalytics, ISS, or more specialized providers, some focusing on maybe your plant is in a flood zone in India and it might get hit by a cyclone or by a drought. We have data on that, and we might have a discussion with you on, well, hang on, have you evaluated the resilience of your productive assets? So, but these are peripheral questions, but that's how we work from an investment point of view.
Thank you very much. I see there are a few questions there, but we will first take one here. Please, Madam, please.
My name is Marion Ehringhaus. I work at Cuperia Consulting on sustainable finance. My question is about collaboration. I mean, Switzerland is not the biggest country in Europe, as we know. We have FINMA, we have CIF, we have WWF, we have AMAS, we have Swiss Bankers Corporation, and a few others, but that's about it. Am I wrong with the observation that maybe they are all somehow working on their own things? Why is, for example, AMAS coming before the Swiss climate score is published? Everybody's publishing his stuff. That's the impression. Maybe you can clarify, because they're all engaged, so that's a positive thing, but everyone is doing his own thing and maybe not even talking to each other closely enough. I think we all know each other, but is the Swiss Bankers Corporation really working together with AMAS and vice versa, and with you and with WWF? If everybody comes up with his own regulations or self-regulated papers, is that the way to go?
Maybe I can answer that. Obviously, doing this on a daily basis, I would have a very different view. So I would say that all of the work you mentioned has been a lot of stakeholder involvement. So, for instance, in the climate scores, it was the various Swiss government agencies, together with NGOs, together with industry, together with university, working on them, publishing them, now supporting them. For instance, you'll have tomorrow AMAS and Swiss Sustainable Finance publishing templates to promote them. We might not all have the same position within these stakeholder engagements. We might be, to some degree, unhappy with the end result that comes out of these engagements, but there's very, very close collaboration. And you obviously have the various aspects. So Banking Association and AMAS working on their self-regulatory work. I would assume AMA's position is that they're quite sympathetic toward, they're very supportive of the climate scores. Maybe they think that it's not yet been adopted in the market, it's very, very fresh, so maybe it's a step too early to include it in this iteration. I cannot speak for AMAS for that, but I would say that that's one of the advantages of Switzerland, is that we almost on a daily basis, we talk with WWF and others. Again, we might not have the same position, but there is a very strong conversation going on.
Yeah, maybe I can add from FINMA side that we are closely collaborating with CIF. We are together in working groups to different topics. We are also engaging with NGOs. Of course, we are in constant dialogue with banks, insurers, asset managers, and so on, and also take in their ideas. But as you said, maybe sometimes we have just different positions.
There's one body you didn't mention, which is SSF, Swiss Sustainable Finance, and today that's really the one industry association that has representation from the financial sector at large, in parallel, of course, with the existing organizations, and I think the transversal role that SSF can play in facilitating discussions between private and public sector is an important one. Now, I have a vested interest in what I'm saying as a former board member of SSF for 6 years, but the story goes on.
Yeah, and I mean, and maybe I'm going to be the one bringing a bit of a nuance. I do think there's a lot of collaboration happening in Switzerland, and we are in exchange, I would say, with most of the bodies, being the SSF, AMAS, SBA. However, last year, and maybe it's at the end of the panel, it's a lot to bring again a new topic, but last year at the Building Bridge, Uli Moher made 2 announcements. One, I think, was around the climate score and the work around that, and the second was around the, and I don't know how to say in English really, but the branch agreement, right? And that was that we will have in Switzerland work on Branchenvereinbarung, like, that the branch will come with, how do you say that in English? Like a global, I don't know. Christoph, you know the English term? No? But you know what I mean, the Branchenvereinbarung, yeah. But net zero. And it was supposed to be really a collaborative effort of the branch with NGO, and a lot to come with a self kind of a branch agreement, we say in English, on net zero null. And this has not really happened, if we're honest. So here I think there is still room for improvement. But maybe I bring that at the end of the panel, so it's a bit like boom.
I need to respond to that because I fully agree what you say. But it's not an example of not enough communication and not enough collaboration. It's a very good example of just very different positions. So I think the issue wasn't that we didn't talk on it.
Agree.
And we keep talking on it. It's an ongoing project, but it's a difficult project, I would say.
Thank you very much.
I agree.
I see that there are a few other persons who want to raise questions, but unfortunately we arrived to the end of this session. We have been told that we have to stop at 5:30 sharp, and it is already 5:30. So I will very quickly, so thank you very much to all of you, the panelists. It was a very, very, yes, you can applaud. Thank you very much. It was very rich and interesting, and I will, Sonia will say 2 words, and then it will be over.
So more than 2 words, but yes, again, thank you very much for this thought-provoking discussion. There are many takeaways from this discussion. Just to give you some of them, 2 maybe. First, there is consensus about the importance of transition plans and how this has to be integrated in the assessment of green products. And also some gaps have been spotted. First, the need for more regulation, in particular to have a better reporting framework in Switzerland, a need for more clarity on transparency, what it entails, really, to allow, among other things, a better data comparison, and finally, a need to better include the corporate level besides the financial sector. So we trust that this session gives you some clues about what it means to be green. Certainly, it gives you, hopefully, some food for thought about other challenges. And one last announcement. So, as Antoine said, this is the close of session of this day, of today, and there is a cocktail outside for those who want to stay and continue thinking, speaking about greenwashing or other things. Thank you very much.